Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The images flicker across the screen in silence. A child's drawing, crude and colorful, taped to a refrigerator door. Then a hospital corridor, fluorescent lights humming over linoleum floors worn thin by decades of footsteps. An abandoned home, its windows dark and empty like the eyes of something long dead. Police lights rotating in the night, casting red and blue shadows across wet pavement. These images mean nothing on their own. But together, they tell a story that has repeated itself throughout human history, in every corner of the world, in cities and small towns, in places where people thought they were safe. Every crime in this story began with trust and ended in betrayal. That's the thread connecting everything you're about to hear. Not madness, though there was plenty of that. Not poverty or abuse, though those played their roles. The common element was simpler and more terrifying. Someone opened a door. Someone believed a promise. Someone looked at another human being and saw safety where there was only hunger. Trust is the foundation of civilization, the invisible contract that allows us to function as a society. We trust that the cars will stop at red lights. We trust that the food we buy isn't poisoned. We trust that the people we love won't hurt us. And most of the time, that trust is rewarded. Most of the time. But not always. What you're about to hear spans decades and crosses state lines. 5 separate cases, 5 different perpetrators, 5 unique sets of circumstances. But the pattern underneath remains constant. These stories are difficult. They involve children. They involve violence. They involve the deliberate destruction of innocent lives. If you need to step away, no one will judge you. If you need to turn this off, that's perfectly reasonable. Some things are hard to hear. Some things should be hard to hear. But these stories also need to be told, because the victims deserve to be remembered, and because the failures that allowed these crimes to happen are still happening today, in different forms, in different places. The first case takes place in Pine Ridge County, somewhere in the southeastern United States. The exact location doesn't matter as much as what happened there, and what didn't happen before it was too late. The second case involves a couple who tried to help someone, who believed in second chances and paid for that belief with their lives. The third case is about a man the system caught once and then released, allowing him to kill again and again until finally, years later, someone connected the dots. The fourth case involves a drifter with fantasies he acted on, with victims whose names are still being discovered. The fifth case reaches back more than a century, to a nurse who smiled while she murdered, who used her position of authority to end lives while pretending to save them. None of these are easy stories, but they're important ones. So let's begin. Daniel Mercer seemed like a man perpetually on the edge of something, though no one could quite identify what. He worked as a software analyst, a job that required precision and patience, qualities he possessed in abundance when it came to his work, but seemed to lack everywhere else. His colleagues described him as competent but withdrawn, the kind of person who completed his assignments without complaint, but never joined the group for lunch, never participated in the holiday parties, never seemed entirely present even when standing right in front of you. He had the look of someone carrying something heavy, though what that weight consisted of remained unclear. He married Lena Cortez in 2009, and over the next decade they had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from 2 to 9 years old by the time this story reaches its conclusion. To outsiders, they appeared to be managing, if not thriving. The children were clean and fed. They attended school regularly. There were no obvious signs of physical abuse, no bruises that couldn't be explained, no broken bones. But those who looked closer saw something else. Teachers noticed that the children were unusually quiet, that they flinched at sudden movements, that they seemed afraid to answer questions incorrectly. The oldest boy told his teacher once that his father got angry when people made mistakes, that the house had to be perfect, that everyone had to follow the rules exactly, or else there would be consequences. The teacher filed a report with social services. An investigator came to the house, spoke with Daniel and Lena, observed the children. The investigator saw a family under stress, certainly, but nothing that rose to the level of intervention. Daniel was polite and cooperative. Lena supported his version of events. The children, when questioned separately, were guarded but not openly afraid. The case was closed. No further action recommended. This was the first failure, but not the last. Daniel's anxiety manifested in control. He needed to know where everyone was at all times. He needed schedules to be followed precisely. Dinner at 6, not 6:15. Bedtime at 8, not 8:30. Deviation from routine caused him visible distress, and that distress radiated outward, infecting the entire household. Lena adapted by becoming hyper-vigilant, by anticipating his needs before he voiced them, by keeping the children quiet and obedient. It was exhausting. It was unsustainable. And eventually, it cracked. Lena had an emotional affair with a coworker. Nothing physical, just messages and phone calls. Someone who listened to her without judgment, who made her feel like a person rather than a household manager. When Daniel discovered the messages on her phone, something inside him broke. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but completely. He filed for divorce immediately. He sought full custody of the children, arguing that Lena was unfit, that she had betrayed the family, that she couldn't be trusted. The legal battle was bitter and prolonged. Friends later said that Daniel seemed to view the divorce not as the end of a failed marriage, but as a personal attack, a deliberate attempt to destroy him. During the custody proceedings, the children's therapist noted signs of parental alienation. The children expressed fear of their mother that seemed coached rather than organic. They repeated phrases that sounded like adult language, not the natural concerns of kids. The court ordered a psychological evaluation. Daniel was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder and obsessive-compulsive tendencies, but nothing that suggested he posed a danger to himself or others. The custody was split. The children would spend weekdays with Lena and weekends with Daniel. Neither parent was satisfied, but that's often how these things end. Compromise rather than resolution. For a few months, the arrangement held. Daniel picked up the children every Friday afternoon and returned them Sunday evening. He followed the schedule precisely, never early, never late. But beneath the surface compliance, something was deteriorating. His coworkers noticed he was making errors, missing deadlines, showing up disheveled and unfocused. He stopped answering his phone. He stopped responding to emails. He seemed to be disappearing into himself, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the anxiety and the need for control. The children noticed too. The oldest boy, 9 years old, told his mother that he didn't want to go back to his father's house anymore. He said his father stayed up all night walking around the house, checking locks, talking to himself. He said his father had stopped cooking meals and instead just gave them cereal for every meal. He said his father cried sometimes, long shaking sobs that scared all of them. Lena called Daniel and tried to discuss the situation. He hung up on her. She called her lawyer. The lawyer said they could file for a modification of custody, but it would take time, and in the meantime, the court order stood. The children had to continue the weekend visits. That was the second Friday of April. The weather was warming, the trees were blooming, and Daniel Mercer picked up his children for what would be their last weekend alive. None of them knew it yet. Maybe some part of Daniel suspected what was coming, but the children still believed they would go home to their mother on Sunday evening. They still believed in a future. What happened in that house over the next 2 days remains partially unclear, reconstructed from forensic evidence and Daniel's later confession. He didn't feed them. He didn't let them sleep. He kept them in the living room, all 5 of them together, while he moved through the house in a state of escalating agitation. He told them that their mother had ruined everything, that the family was broken, that there was no point in continuing. The children were terrified, but they had been trained by years of his volatility to stay quiet, to not provoke him, to wait for the storm to pass. But this time, the storm didn't pass. On Saturday afternoon, one of the children asked if they could call their mother. This simple request seemed to trigger something. Daniel later said he realized in that moment that he had lost them, that they loved their mother more than they loved him, that he would always be the outsider in his own family. It's a narcissistic interpretation, a reframing of normal childhood attachment as personal betrayal. But in his fractured mental state, it felt true, and it felt unforgivable. He killed them over the course of several hours on Saturday night and Sunday morning. The method doesn't need to be described in detail. It was violent. It was intimate. It required him to look each child in the face as he ended their life. The oldest boy fought. The others were too young or too shocked to resist effectively. By Sunday afternoon, all 5 children were dead, and Daniel Mercer sat in his living room surrounded by their bodies, trying to decide what to do next. He spent hours cleaning. Methodically, obsessively, the same precision he brought to his work now applied to erasing evidence of what he had done. He wiped down surfaces, bagged clothing, wrapped each small body carefully, as if preparing them for some grim journey. The house had to be perfect. Even now, especially now, everything had to follow a plan. He loaded the bodies into his car, filling the trunk and back seat, covering them with blankets and bags. He locked the house, checked the lock twice, then 3 times, then drove away from Pine Ridge County as the sun was setting on Sunday evening. Lena called at 8 o'clock, the scheduled return time. No answer. She called again at 8:30, at 9, at 9:30. She drove to his house. The lights were off. His car was gone. She called the police to report that he had violated the custody agreement, that he had taken the children and wasn't responding. The police told her it had only been a few hours, that sometimes these situations resolve themselves, that they would make a note of it. She should call back in the morning if he still hadn't returned them. This was the 3rd failure. Daniel drove through the night, heading west on highways that cut through darkness and farmland. He later said he didn't have a destination, that he was just moving, that as long as he kept driving he didn't have to think about what was in the car with him. He stopped once for gas, paying in cash, not making eye contact with the attendant. He drove until exhaustion forced him to pull over at a rest stop, where he slept in the car for a few hours before continuing. By Monday afternoon he had crossed 3 state lines. The police in Pine Ridge County had upgraded the situation to a possible abduction by Monday morning. Lena had filed an emergency motion. Daniel's employer reported he hadn't shown up for work. His phone was off. His credit cards weren't being used. An Amber Alert was issued for all 5 children. Their photos appeared on highways and news broadcasts, 5 young faces staring out at the world, asking for help that would never come. Daniel was pulled over Tuesday morning in a rural stretch of highway in a neighboring state. The reason was mundane, a broken taillight and erratic driving that suggested possible intoxication. The state trooper who approached the car noticed Daniel seemed disoriented, that his hands were shaking on the steering wheel, that he smelled of sweat, and something else, something sweet and wrong. The trooper asked for license and registration. Daniel provided them without speaking. The trooper ran the information and saw the Amber Alert. He returned to the car with his hand on his weapon and asked Daniel to step out of the vehicle. Daniel complied. He didn't resist. He didn't run. When the trooper asked where the children were, Daniel pointed at the car. The trooper looked inside and saw the shapes under the blankets, saw enough to understand what he was looking at, and immediately called for backup. Daniel sat on the ground with his hands behind his head and said nothing. He had driven more than 800 miles with his dead children in the car, and now it was over. The confession came in pieces over several hours of interrogation. Daniel initially claimed it was an accident, that things had gotten out of control, that he didn't remember exactly what happened. But the forensic evidence didn't support that narrative. The injuries were too deliberate, the timeline too extended. Eventually he admitted the truth, or at least his version of it. He said he couldn't bear the thought of them being raised by Lena, that she had poisoned them against him, that this was the only way to keep the family together. He said he knew it was wrong, but he couldn't see any other option. He said he was sorry, but he didn't sound sorry. He sounded empty. The trial took place 10 months later. Daniel's defense attorney attempted to argue diminished capacity, to present him as a man driven to temporary insanity by the stress of divorce and custody battles. The prosecution presented a different picture, a man who had planned and executed the murder of 5 children over a period of hours, who had then attempted to flee and hide the evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Daniel showed no reaction as the sentence was read. Lena, sitting in the gallery, wept silently. The children were buried together in a cemetery outside Pine Ridge County. More than 200 people attended the service. Teachers and classmates, neighbors who had watched them play in the yard, family members who would now carry this loss for the rest of their lives. 5 small caskets in a row. Someone had placed their favorite toys beside them. A baseball glove, a stuffed rabbit, a set of colored pencils, objects that had meant everything to children who would never grow old enough to stop caring about such things. In the aftermath, there were the predictable questions. Could this have been prevented? Were there warning signs that were missed? Should the custody arrangement have been different? A review of the social services investigation found that proper protocols had been followed, that based on the information available at the time, the investigator had made a reasonable decision. But reasonable doesn't mean correct. Those children had tried to tell someone they were afraid. Someone had listened, had filed a report, had triggered an investigation. And still it hadn't been enough. Daniel Mercer sits in a maximum security prison now, serving his 5 life sentences in a state far from where he committed his crimes. In prison interviews, he has expressed remorse, though it's difficult to know if that remorse is genuine or simply what he thinks he's supposed to say. He claims he thinks about his children every day, that he wishes he could take it back, that he doesn't understand how he could have done what he did. But wishes don't resurrect the dead. Understanding doesn't undo actions. His children are gone, and they're not coming back, and that's something he will have to live with for whatever decades remain to him. The story could end there, with one man's catastrophic failure of humanity. But there are 4 more cases to examine, for more instances of trust betrayed and lives destroyed. The next case involves 2 people who believed in second chances, who opened their home to someone they thought deserved another opportunity, and who paid for that generosity with their lives. Victor Hale walked out of Grantsville State Prison on a Tuesday morning in September after serving 18 years for armed robbery. He was 41 years old. He had entered prison as a young man and emerged middle-aged, with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. The world he returned to was different from the one he had left. Technology had advanced. Social norms had shifted. He felt like a time traveler, dislocated and uncertain. Prison provides structure. Every hour is accounted for, every movement monitored, every decision made by someone else. Freedom, when it finally comes, can feel more like abandonment than liberation. Victor had a parole officer, a halfway house assignment, and a bus ticket. He had no job, no family willing to take him in, no real plan beyond surviving one day at a time. He spent his first week of freedom sleeping on a cot in a crowded room with 11 other recently released men, applying for jobs he knew he wouldn't get, and wondering if he had made a mistake agreeing to parole instead of just finishing his sentence. During his last 5 years in prison, Victor had corresponded with Marianne Cole, a woman who volunteered with a prison reform organization. She had been incarcerated herself years earlier, had served time for fraud and drug charges, and had emerged determined to help others make the transition back to society. She wrote to dozens of inmates, offering encouragement and practical advice. With Victor, the correspondence had become more personal. They wrote about their lives, their regrets, their hopes for the future. When Victor was released, Marianne offered to help him find work and housing. Marianne lived with her partner Edwin Cole in a modest house in Northwood Heights, a working-class suburb about 30 miles from the city. Edwin was retired military, a quiet man who spent his days working on projects in the garage and volunteering at the local community center. The house was cluttered but comfortable, filled with books and craft supplies and evidence of 2 people building a life together. They had been together for 12 years. Neither had children. They filled their time with each other and with their various causes and hobbies. When Marianne suggested that Victor stay with them temporarily while he got on his feet, Edwin was hesitant but agreed. He trusted his partner's judgment, and he shared her belief that people deserved second chances. So Victor moved into their spare bedroom, a small room at the back of the house that had previously served as storage. They cleared out the boxes and set up a bed. Marianne helped him apply for jobs. Edwin taught him how to use a smartphone and navigate the internet. For a few weeks, it seemed to be working. But Victor was struggling more than he let on. The halfway house had been bad, but at least there he had been around people who understood what it felt like to be released after years inside. In Marianne and Edwin's house, he felt like an imposter, like he was play-acting at normal life without really understanding the rules. He couldn't sleep. The silence at night was oppressive after years of constant noise. He would lie awake listening to the house settling, to cars passing on the street outside, to the sound of his own breathing. He started drinking, small amounts at first, buying cheap vodka and hiding it in his room, taking sips throughout the day to quiet the anxiety. Marianne noticed, but didn't confront him immediately. She had seen this pattern before with other people she had tried to help. She thought if she gave him time and support, he would stabilize. Edwin was less patient. He told Marianne privately that he thought Victor needed more help than they could provide, that maybe he should go back to the halfway house or find a different living situation. Marianne asked for more time. Edwin agreed, reluctantly. The tension in the house grew. Victor became withdrawn, spending most of his time in his room or out walking the neighborhood for hours. When Marianne tried to talk to him, he was defensive, insisting everything was fine, that he just needed more time to adjust. Edwin avoided him when possible, uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to override Marianne's wishes. The three of them moved around each other like strangers forced to share space, each waiting for something to change. It changed on a Thursday night in November, 3 months after Victor had moved in. Edwin was in the living room watching television. Marianne was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. Victor was in his room, or so they thought. What happened next occurred quickly, without warning, without any obvious trigger. Victor later claimed that he heard them talking about him, that he believed they were planning to kick him out, that he felt cornered and reacted defensively. But neither Marianne nor Edwin had said anything of the sort that evening. They had barely spoken to each other, let alone about Victor. Victor came out of his room carrying a kitchen knife he had taken earlier in the day. He walked up behind Edwin first, while the older man sat in his recliner focused on the television screen. The attack was sudden and brutal. Edwin didn't have time to defend himself, didn't have time to call out or stand up, or do anything except raise his hands instinctively as Victor brought the knife down again and again. The violence was frenzied, chaotic, fueled by something that had been building inside Victor for months, maybe years, maybe his entire life. Marianne heard the commotion and came running from the kitchen. She saw Edwin slumped in the chair, saw Victor standing over him with the knife, saw the blood spreading across the upholstery. She screamed and turned to run, but Victor was faster. He caught her before she reached the door, tackled her to the ground, and stabbed her repeatedly while she fought and pleaded and tried to crawl away. Her last conscious thought was probably confusion, an inability to reconcile the man she had tried to help with the person who was killing her. Trust and betrayal happening simultaneously, the gap between them so small it couldn't even be measured. When it was over, Victor stood in the living room breathing hard, the knife still in his hand, surrounded by evidence of what he had done. He could have run. He could have taken Edwin's car and driven away, gotten a head start before anyone discovered the bodies. Instead, he did something stranger and more disturbing. He stayed. He dragged Edwin's body into the spare bedroom where he had been sleeping. He wrapped it in blankets and plastic sheeting, working methodically, taking his time to do it right. Then he did the same with Marianne, wrapping her carefully and placing her next to Edwin in the small room. He closed the door. He cleaned the living room and kitchen as best he could, scrubbing blood from the floor and furniture, opening windows to air out the smell. Then he went to sleep in Marianne and Edwin's bed, in their room, as if the house was now his. Victor lived in that house for 9 days with the bodies decomposing in the spare room. He ate their food. He watched their television. He wore Edwin's clothes. He didn't go outside except late at night to throw away cleaning supplies and bloodied rags in dumpsters blocks away. During the day, he kept the curtains closed and the doors locked. If anyone knocked, he didn't answer. He later said he wasn't planning anything, wasn't thinking about what to do next. He was just existing in a suspended moment, pretending the outside world didn't exist. Neighbors noticed that Marianne and Edwin's car hadn't moved in over a week. They noticed the curtains were always drawn, which was unusual. One neighbor tried calling, but the phone rang unanswered. Another neighbor stopped by and knocked, but no one came to the door. They told themselves that maybe the couple had gone on vacation and forgotten to mention it. But the accumulating newspapers on the driveway and the mail overflowing from the mailbox suggested otherwise. By the end of the second week, concern had turned to worry. The smell became noticeable around day 10. A neighbor walking past the house caught it and initially thought maybe an animal had died under the porch. But the smell grew stronger over the next 2 days, unmistakable to anyone who came near the property. Someone called the police to request a wellness check. 2 officers arrived and knocked on the door. No answer. They walked around the property, trying to look through windows, and the smell grew overwhelming. They called for backup and authorization to enter the home. When they broke down the front door, Victor was sitting in the living room watching television as if nothing was wrong. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't try to explain or justify what he had done. He simply stood up, put his hands behind his back, and allowed himself to be handcuffed. The officers found the bodies in the spare room, wrapped and hidden but impossible to miss because of the smell. The crime scene investigators who processed the house later said it was one of the strangest cases they had encountered. Not the violence itself, which was sadly familiar, but the aftermath. The way Victor had stayed in the house, had lived among the evidence of his crime, as if he had simply moved into a new home rather than murdered the previous occupants. The trial took place 8 months later. Victor's public defender tried to argue self-defense, claiming that Victor had felt threatened, that Mary Ann and Edwin had been planning to report him to his parole officer for drinking, that he had reacted out of fear rather than malice. The prosecution presented evidence that contradicted this narrative. Edwin had been attacked from behind while sitting down. Mary Ann had been stabbed repeatedly while trying to flee. There was no indication either victim had threatened Victor or even confronted him that evening. The forensic evidence showed the attack was one-sided and sustained, not a momentary loss of control, but a deliberate act of violence. The jury found Victor guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Victor would return to prison, this time forever, for killing 2 people whose only crime had been trying to help him. During the sentencing hearing, Mary Ann's sister read a victim impact statement describing her sister's dedication to helping others, her belief in redemption and second chances, her genuine goodness. She said that Mary Ann had died doing what she loved, trying to make the world better. But she also said that her sister's kindness had been weaponized against her, that the system that released Victor without adequate support or supervision had failed everyone involved. Edwin's military friends attended the trial in uniform, sitting in silent witness to what had happened to their friend. After the verdict, several of them spoke to reporters about Edwin's character, his service to his country, his quiet generosity. One friend said that Edwin had been skeptical about Victor staying with them, but had trusted his partner's judgment, had put aside his own concerns to support her work. That trust, that willingness to help despite reservations, had cost him his life. The community in Northwood Heights struggled with the aftermath. There were vigils and memorials. There were debates about the prison system, about parole policies, about how to balance compassion with safety. Some people argued that Mary Ann and Edwin had been naive, that they should have known better than to invite a convicted felon into their home. Others defended them, saying that their compassion was admirable, that the failure was systemic rather than personal. Both perspectives carried truth, but neither brought Mary Ann and Edwin back. Victor Hale sits in prison now, back in an environment he understands better than freedom. In interviews, he has expressed remorse, though like Daniel Mercer, it's difficult to know if that remorse is genuine or performative. He claims he doesn't understand why he did what he did, that something came over him that night, that he wishes he could undo it. But wishes are empty. Actions have consequences. 2 people are dead because they tried to help someone, because they believed in second chances, because they were willing to extend trust to someone who didn't deserve it. The third case we need to examine involves a different kind of failure. Not the failure to see warning signs, not the failure to protect vulnerable people, but the failure to keep a known predator locked away. Marcus Bell was a killer at 19, and the system knew it. They caught him, tried him, imprisoned him, and then they let him go. Marcus Bell grew up in instability. His father was absent. His mother cycled through relationships with men who ranged from neglectful to abusive. He was raised in apartments and trailer parks, moving every few months, attending a dozen different schools before dropping out at 16. He had no friends, no interests beyond violent movies and pornography, no apparent plans for the future. He worked odd jobs when he could find them, mostly manual labor that paid under the table, and spent his money on alcohol and drugs that numbed whatever he was feeling. At 19, Marcus started dating a girl named Crystal Shaw. She was 17, a high school dropout working at a fast food restaurant, living with her grandmother in a small town in the rural Midwest. The relationship was turbulent from the start. They fought constantly, broke up and got back together, existed in a cycle of intensity and dysfunction that neither seemed capable of escaping. Crystal's grandmother didn't like Marcus, told her granddaughter he was trouble, that she should stay away from him. Crystal ignored the advice. She thought she could change him, or maybe she just didn't think she deserved better. They had been together for 3 months when Marcus killed her. The argument that preceded it was about something trivial, the kind of minor disagreement that healthy couples resolve with a conversation. But Marcus wasn't capable of healthy conflict resolution. When Crystal said she wanted to break up, wanted to see other people, wanted him out of her life, something inside him snapped. He strangled her in her grandmother's living room while the older woman was at work. Then he panicked. He wrapped Crystal's body in a blanket, carried her to his car, and drove to a remote area outside town. He tried to burn the body, pouring gasoline over it and lighting it on fire, but the flames didn't consume everything. When hunters found the remains 2 weeks later, there was enough left for identification. The investigation moved quickly. Marcus was the obvious suspect. He had been seen arguing with Crystal the day she disappeared. His car had been spotted on the road leading to where the body was found. When police searched his apartment, they found Crystal's necklace and her phone. When they questioned him, he broke down and confessed. He said it was an accident, that he hadn't meant to kill her, that he just wanted her to stop talking. But the forensic evidence told a different story. Strangulation takes time. It requires sustained pressure. It's not something that happens accidentally or in a moment of passion. It's a deliberate act. Marcus was charged with second-degree murder. His public defender negotiated a plea deal. Marcus would plead guilty and receive a sentence of 15 to 30 years in prison. At 19, this seemed like a lifetime. But it wasn't. He served 15 years, the minimum, and was released on parole at age 34. He had taken the required classes in prison. He had seen the counselors. He had followed the rules and done his time. On paper, he was rehabilitated. In reality, nothing had changed except that he was older and more careful. Marcus moved to a different state after his release, settling in a mid-sized city where no one knew his history. He found work in construction, showed up on time, kept to himself. His parole officer visited once a month, asked the required questions, filed the required reports. Everything seemed fine. Marcus seemed fine. He was compliant, employed, staying out of trouble. But compliance isn't the same as change. Following rules isn't the same as becoming a different person. 6 months after his release, a woman named Angela Martinez disappeared. She was 23, worked as a waitress at a diner near where Marcus lived, and was last seen leaving work late one evening. Her car was found abandoned 2 days later in a parking lot across town. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of foul play, just an empty vehicle with her keys still in the ignition. Police investigated but had no leads. Angela had no enemies, no volatile relationships, no reason anyone could identify for her to vanish. After a few weeks, the case went cold. She became another name in a database of missing persons, another face on a flyer that people stopped noticing. 8 months later, another woman disappeared. Jennifer Kim, 19 years old, college student, last seen walking home from a friend's house around midnight. Her route took her through a residential area that was generally considered safe. Security cameras caught her on the first block of her walk, but after that, nothing. She simply vanished. Police searched the area, interviewed neighbors, checked her phone records and social media. No leads, no evidence, no body. Just another young woman gone without explanation. The third disappearance happened 4 months after that. Sarah Louise Chun, 26, nurse at a local hospital, disappeared after her shift ended at 7 in the morning. She never made it home. Her boyfriend reported her missing when she didn't answer her phone. Her car was found at the hospital parking garage, locked and undisturbed. Police reviewed security footage and saw her walking to her car, getting in, but the camera angle didn't show what happened after that. Once again, the investigation stalled. 3 women, all young, all disappeared within 18 months in the same general area. But the police didn't connect the cases. Different investigators were assigned to each one. Different theories were pursued. The possibility of a serial predator was discussed, but not seriously investigated. The 4th victim was 15-year-old Amanda Torres. She disappeared walking home from school on an afternoon in late spring. Her backpack was found on the sidewalk 3 blocks from her house. Her phone was inside, undamaged. The last call she had received was from her mother asking what she wanted for dinner. Amanda never answered. The community was terrified. A missing adult was concerning, but a missing child triggered a different level of fear and urgency. There were search parties, news coverage, pressure on law enforcement to find answers. But answers didn't come. Marcus Bell had killed all 4 of them. He had learned from his first murder, had developed a system. He targeted women who were alone, who were vulnerable, who could be approached without raising immediate alarm. He was patient. He would watch someone for days or weeks, learning their patterns, identifying opportunities. When he made his move, it was quick and decisive. He would overpower them, transport them to a location he had prepared in advance, and then he would strangle them. Just like Crystal Shaw. Just like he had done at 19. The method never changed because it worked. After each murder, he would burn the body. He had learned that fire was an effective way to destroy evidence, to make identification difficult, to buy himself time. He would drive to remote areas, places where people rarely went, and build a fire. He would stay until the body was consumed, then scatter the ashes and leave. It was methodical and cold, a routine he had perfected over multiple victims. He felt no remorse, no guilt, no connection to the people he killed. They were objects to him, things that served a purpose and were then disposed of. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. A fisherman in a state park found bone fragments near a fire pit that had been used recently. He thought they might be from a deer, that someone had been illegally hunting and processing game in the park. He reported it to park rangers, who called the police. A forensic anthropologist examined the fragments and determined they were human. A young woman, based on the bone structure. The discovery prompted a search of the surrounding area, and investigators found more fragments at 2 additional fire sites within a 5-mile radius. DNA analysis connected the remains to Angela Martinez and Jennifer Kim. Suddenly, what had been 3 separate missing persons cases and 1 unsolved disappearance became a serial murder investigation. A task force was formed. Evidence from all 4 cases was reviewed and compared. Security footage was re-examined. Witness statements were reconsidered, and patterns began to emerge. Multiple witnesses had seen a man in a dark blue pickup truck in the vicinity of where the women had disappeared. The truck had been noted but not prioritized in the individual investigations. Now it became crucial. Police obtained traffic camera footage and began tracking vehicles matching that description. 1 truck appeared near 3 of the 4 disappearance locations. They traced the registration and found Marcus Bell. When they looked into his background, everything clicked into place. Prior conviction for murder. Recently released on parole. Living in the area where the disappearances had occurred. The parole officer was contacted and confirmed that Marcus drove a dark blue pickup truck. A warrant was issued immediately. Police arrested Marcus at his apartment early one morning. He didn't resist. He didn't seem surprised. He asked for a lawyer and said nothing else. The evidence against him was circumstantial but compelling. His truck near multiple crime scenes. His history of killing a young woman by strangulation. Burn patterns at the fire sites consistent with accelerants found in his garage. Cell phone data placing him near the locations where the victims had disappeared. It was enough for charges on all 4 murders. Though without bodies in 2 of the cases, the prosecution knew the trial would be challenging. Marcus eventually confessed, not out of remorse, but seemingly out of a desire to control the narrative. He admitted to killing all 4 women. He provided details about how he had selected them, how he had abducted them, how he had killed them and disposed of their bodies. He led investigators to locations where they found additional remains. He spoke about the murders with detachment, as if describing something he had observed rather than committed. The psychologist who evaluated him diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, a clinical way of saying he lacked empathy, conscience, or capacity for genuine human connection. The trial was excruciating for the families. They had to listen to details of how their daughters, sisters, girlfriends had died. They had to look at photos of the evidence, the burn sites, the fragments that were all that remained. Marcus showed no emotion throughout. He sat at the defense table staring straight ahead, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, but otherwise appearing bored. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, he showed no reaction. When the judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, he simply nodded. But the verdict didn't provide closure. The families wanted to know how this had been allowed to happen. Marcus Bell had been convicted of murder at 19. He had strangled a woman and burned her body. And 15 years later, the parole board had released him, had decided he was safe to return to society. Within 6 months of his release, he had killed again. And he had continued killing because no one was watching closely enough to stop him. The parole board defended their decision, saying Marcus had completed all required programs, had shown no disciplinary problems in prison, had met every criterion for release. But criteria on paper don't capture reality. Compliance doesn't equal rehabilitation. Marcus had learned how to navigate the system, how to say the right things and display the right behaviors. He had fooled counselors and psychologists and parole officers. Or maybe he hadn't fooled them at all. Maybe they had just been checking boxes, following procedures, moving cases through the system without really examining whether someone was safe to release. The families filed lawsuits against the state, arguing that the parole board had been negligent, that they had released a dangerous offender without adequate supervision. The cases were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. Money couldn't bring back Angela, Jennifer, Sarah, or Amanda, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that the system had failed, that these deaths could have been prevented if someone had made different decisions 15 years earlier. Marcus Bell sits in prison now, this time with no possibility of ever being released. He will die there, eventually, after decades of existence in a cage. Some people might argue that's justice. Others might say it's not nearly enough, that 4 lives taken deserve more punishment than simply being housed and fed for the rest of his natural life. But the criminal justice system isn't designed for vengeance, at least not officially. It's designed for public safety and theoretically for rehabilitation. In Marcus's case, rehabilitation was never possible. He was a predator at 19 and remained a predator at 34. Prison didn't change him. It just delayed him. The 4th case moves into even darker territory, into the realm of the transient and the unaccounted for, where victims disappear and sometimes are never connected to their killer at all. Caleb Rowe was a drifter, a man without roots or connections, someone who moved through the world leaving very little trace except for the bodies he left behind. Caleb grew up in the Southwest, the son of a truck driver who was rarely home and a mother who worked double shifts at a casino. He was essentially raised by neglect, left alone for long stretches, learning early that no one was coming to take care of him. He dropped out of school at 14 and started hitchhiking across the region, sleeping wherever he could find shelter, stealing food when he was hungry, occasionally finding odd jobs that paid enough for a meal and maybe a night in a cheap motel. By his 20s, Caleb had developed a pattern. He would drift into a town, stay for a few weeks or months, and then move on. He worked construction when he could, day labor when he couldn't. He had a girlfriend at one point, a woman named Rebecca who lived in a trailer park outside Redstone City. They were together for almost a year, which was the longest Caleb had ever stayed in one place. Then Rebecca disappeared. She was reported missing by her sister, who said Rebecca had mentioned wanting to end the relationship with Caleb, that she was afraid of him, that he had become increasingly controlling and violent. Police questioned Caleb, but he claimed Rebecca had left on her own, that she had talked about going to California, that he hadn't seen her in several days. There was no evidence of foul play. Rebecca's belongings were gone from the trailer. Her bank account had been accessed the day she disappeared. The case was investigated but eventually filed as a voluntary missing person. Rebecca's body was never found. Years later, Caleb would admit to killing her, to burying her remains in the desert where they would never be recovered. But at the time, without a body, without witnesses, without any physical evidence linking him to her disappearance, the investigation stalled. Caleb moved on to the next town, the next job, the next temporary situation. And he carried with him the knowledge that he had gotten away with murder. Something changed in Caleb after Rebecca. Or maybe nothing changed. Maybe he had always been capable of this, and Rebecca had simply been the first time he acted on it. Either way, the violence escalated. He developed fantasies about power and control, about the ability to end someone's life and walk away. He started viewing people as disposable, as objects that existed for his use and could be discarded when they were no longer needed. He moved to Redstone City and found work with a construction crew. The job didn't pay much, but it was steady and it came with housing. He shared a house with 3 other workers, men who kept to themselves and didn't ask questions about each other's pasts. It was the kind of arrangement that suited Caleb perfectly. Anonymous, temporary, forgettable. He could exist there without anyone really seeing him. The first killing in Redstone City was a man named Thomas who worked the same construction sites. Thomas had gotten into an argument with Caleb over something trivial, had embarrassed him in front of other workers, had made him look weak. Caleb couldn't let that stand. He waited until they were alone in the house one evening and attacked Thomas with a hammer. The violence was sudden and overwhelming. Thomas died quickly, probably without understanding what was happening or why. Caleb dismembered the body in the bathtub, a process that took hours and required a coldness and detachment that most people couldn't comprehend. He wrapped the pieces in plastic bags, loaded them into his truck, and drove to various dumpsters across the city, distributing the remains so that even if they were discovered, they wouldn't immediately be connected. Then he cleaned the bathroom, scrubbing away blood and tissue, eliminating evidence. The next morning, when the other roommates asked where Thomas was, Caleb said he had gotten into his truck and driven off in the middle of the night, that he had probably quit without telling anyone. It happens sometimes with workers like them. People came and went without explanation. The second victim was one of the other roommates, a man named David who had started asking too many questions about Thomas, who had noticed inconsistencies in Caleb's story, who seemed suspicious. Caleb couldn't risk being exposed. He killed David the same way, with sudden violence followed by methodical disposal. He dismembered the body, burned some of the pieces in a fire pit in the backyard, and scattered the rest across the city. 2 men had now disappeared from the house, but no one reported them missing. They were transient workers, people without families or connections, the kind of people who could vanish and no one would notice. The third victim was a woman Caleb met at a bar. Her name was Lisa, and she made the mistake of being friendly to him, of accepting a drink, of agreeing to go back to his place. She probably thought she was being polite, or maybe she was attracted to him, or maybe she was just lonely and wanted company. Whatever her reasoning, it was a fatal error. Caleb strangled her in the house that night. He kept her body for 2 days, doing things to it that don't need to be described in detail, but that demonstrated a complete loss of humanity. Then he dismembered and disposed of her remains the same way he had with the others. By this point, Caleb had convinced himself that he was special, that he had transcended normal human limitations, that he was operating on a higher plane of existence. He developed a delusional spiritual framework for his actions, claiming that the killings were rituals, that he was releasing the souls of his victims, that he was performing a sacred duty. None of this was based in any actual religious tradition. It was the construction of a diseased mind trying to justify the unjustifiable. The final victim discovered was the third roommate, a man named Carlos who had lived in the house the entire time Caleb had been killing. Carlos had noticed the disappearances, had noticed the strange smells coming from Caleb's room and the bathroom, had noticed the way Caleb would leave at odd hours with large bags. But Carlos was undocumented, terrified of drawing attention from authorities, and so he said nothing. Until one night when he confronted Caleb, told him he knew what he had been doing, threatened to call the police. Caleb killed him that same night. The discovery of the crimes came from a sanitation worker who noticed human remains in a dumpster behind a strip mall. The police were called. The remains were examined and identified as belonging to Lisa through dental records. The discovery prompted a search of other dumpsters in the area, and more remains were found. DNA analysis identified Thomas and David. A pattern emerged, and investigators realized they were dealing with multiple murders, possibly by the same perpetrator. The investigation focused on the house where Thomas and David had lived. Police interviewed the construction company that had employed them, obtained a list of everyone who had worked with them or lived with them. Caleb's name came up multiple times. When they went to the house to question him, they found it abandoned. Caleb had disappeared, but in searching the house, they found evidence. Blood traces in the bathroom despite Caleb's cleaning efforts. Bone fragments in the backyard fire pit. And in Caleb's room, they found journals filled with his delusional writings, descriptions of the killings framed as spiritual experiences, notes about his victims. A manhunt was launched. Caleb's photo was circulated to law enforcement agencies across the region. Tips started coming in. Someone had seen him at a truck stop. Someone else had given him a ride. He was moving again, drifting, trying to put distance between himself and Redstone City. But he made a mistake. He used his real name at a motel, paid with a credit card that had been linked to him through the investigation. Police tracked the transaction and descended on the motel within hours. Caleb was arrested without incident. He seemed almost relieved, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment. In custody, he waived his right to a lawyer and started talking. He confessed to killing Thomas, David, Lisa, and Carlos. He also confessed to killing Rebecca years earlier. And he hinted at other victims, people he had killed during his years of drifting, bodies buried in the desert or left in places they would never be found. Investigators tried to get specifics, locations, names, anything that could help identify additional victims. But Caleb's memories were vague, or he was deliberately withholding information. He seemed to enjoy having knowledge that investigators wanted, seemed to relish the power it gave him even in custody. The trial was straightforward. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The journals provided documentation of his intent and mindset. His confession eliminated any question of guilt. The defense tried to argue that Caleb was legally insane, that his delusional belief system meant he couldn't distinguish right from wrong. But the prosecution brought in experts who testified that Caleb's delusions were self-serving rationalizations, that he knew his actions were wrong and illegal, that he had taken extensive steps to avoid detection and dispose of evidence. Someone who is truly insane doesn't clean crime scenes and distribute body parts across a city to avoid detection. The jury found Caleb guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor noted that Caleb's victims had been among the most vulnerable members of society. Transient workers with no families to report them missing. An undocumented immigrant too afraid to go to authorities. A woman who had made the mistake of showing kindness to a stranger. These were people who existed on the margins, whose disappearances could easily be overlooked or explained away. Caleb had preyed on that vulnerability, had selected victims who he thought wouldn't be missed. In the aftermath, there were broader questions raised about how many other victims might exist. Caleb had been drifting for more than a decade. He had been in dozens of towns and cities across multiple states. How many other people had disappeared during those years? How many other bodies were buried in the desert or scattered in dumpsters? Investigators tried to track his movements, to correlate his presence with unsolved disappearances. They identified several possible additional victims, but without confessions from Caleb or physical evidence, they couldn't prove the connections. There was also attention paid to the fact that some of Caleb's potential victims might have been indigenous women, part of a larger crisis of missing and murdered indigenous people that often receives insufficient attention from law enforcement. Advocacy groups used Caleb's case to highlight systemic failures in investigating disappearances in indigenous communities, to demand better resources and more serious treatment of these cases. Caleb's capture didn't solve that larger problem, but it brought it into public consciousness in a way that mattered. Caleb Rowe sits in prison now, in a maximum security facility where he is kept separate from the general population for his own safety. He has given occasional interviews in which he maintains his delusional framework, claiming that he was chosen for a special purpose, that his actions had meaning beyond what ordinary people could understand. Mental health professionals who have evaluated him describe him as a malignant narcissist with psychopathic traits, someone who lacks empathy entirely and views other people as objects. There is no possibility of rehabilitation, no treatment that could address the fundamental brokenness of his psychology. He will remain in prison until he dies, which is the only way to ensure he never hurts anyone else. If you're still with us, I want to take a moment to acknowledge how heavy these stories are. We've covered 4 cases so far, each one involving betrayal and violence, each one representing multiple lives destroyed. If you need to pause, if you need to step away and come back later, that's completely understandable. These aren't easy stories to hear, and they're not meant to be entertainment in the traditional sense. They're meant to be reminders of the darkness that exists in the world, and of the importance of vigilance, of taking warning signs seriously, of not looking away when something feels wrong. The 5th and final case reaches back more than a century, to a time before modern forensics, before criminal profiling, before many of the tools we now use to identify and stop serial killers. But the fundamental pattern remains the same. Someone in a position of trust, someone whose role gave them access to vulnerable people, someone who used that access to kill. Eleanor Bright was born Nora Kelly in 1873 in a small industrial town in the Northeast. Her childhood was marked by poverty and abuse. Her father was an alcoholic who worked sporadically in the mills when he was sober enough to hold a job. Her mother was overwhelmed and distant, unable to protect her children from her husband's violence. Nora was the oldest of 6 children, which meant she bore the brunt of caring for her younger siblings while also enduring her father's rage. She left home at 16, lying about her age to get work as a domestic servant in a wealthy household. The work was hard, but it was stable, and more importantly, it removed her from her father's presence. She worked for that family for 3 years, learning how upper-class households operated, absorbing ideas about respectability and presentation. When she left that position, she reinvented herself. Nora Kelly disappeared, and Eleanor Bright emerged, a young woman with a fabricated background and impeccable manners who sought training as a nurse. Nursing in the late 19th century was not yet the professionalized field it would become. Training was minimal, standards were loose, and many women entered the profession with little more than basic instruction and a willingness to work. Eleanor excelled in her training, not because she had any particular aptitude for medicine, but because she understood how to present herself, how to inspire confidence, how to make people trust her. She was always smiling, always cheerful, always willing to take on extra shifts or difficult patients. Doctors praised her dedication. Patients' families were grateful for her attentiveness. She worked in hospitals for several years before transitioning to private nursing, caring for patients in their homes. This was where she found her true calling, though not in the way her employers imagined. Private nursing gave her autonomy, gave her time alone with patients, gave her opportunities that hospital work never could. She cared for elderly patients mostly, people with chronic conditions who needed full-time assistance, people whose deaths would not be particularly surprising or suspicious. The first murder was almost accidental. An elderly man she was caring for was in significant pain from cancer. Eleanor had been giving him morphine as prescribed, but one night, she gave him more than the doctor had ordered. Much more. The man died peacefully in his sleep, and Eleanor was there to discover the body in the morning, to call the family, to comfort them in their grief. The family was grateful that their father had passed without suffering, that Eleanor had been there with him at the end. They paid her bonus and gave her glowing references. Eleanor had discovered something important. She had discovered that she liked the power of deciding when someone would die. She liked the control it gave her, the way it made her feel special and significant. She liked the gratitude of families who believed she had provided compassionate care in their loved ones' final hours. And she liked that no one suspected her, that her smile and her gentle manner made her above suspicion. She killed again a few months later. Another elderly patient, another morphine overdose, another peaceful death that no one questioned. And then again, and again. Over the next 12 years, Eleanor Bright worked for more than 40 families, and at least 30 of her patients died under suspicious circumstances. Not all of them were elderly. Some were middle-aged people with chronic, but not immediately terminal conditions. Some recovered briefly under her care before sudden relapses. Some died much sooner than their doctors had expected. But it was the early 1900s. Medical knowledge was limited. Autopsies were rare. Deaths were often attributed to the progression of disease or to natural causes without much investigation. And Eleanor was so good at her job, so professional and compassionate, that no one thought to question whether she might be causing the deaths rather than simply witnessing them. She varied her methods occasionally. Sometimes it was morphine. Sometimes it was other medications given in incorrect doses. Sometimes it was subtle things, like giving a diabetic patient sugar or withholding water from someone with kidney disease. She learned what would and wouldn't raise suspicion, how to make a death look natural, how to avoid patterns that might be noticed. She was methodical and careful, and she operated for more than a decade without anyone realizing what she was doing. The beginning of the end came when a doctor named Harrison Matthews started noticing something odd. He had referred several patients to Eleanor Bright over the years, and while he knew that his patients were seriously ill and that deaths were to be expected, the timing bothered him. Several of his patients had died much sooner than he had anticipated, and all of them had been under Eleanor's care. He mentioned his concerns to a colleague, who dismissed them as coincidence. Patients died. That's what happened when you worked with seriously ill people. But Dr. Matthews couldn't shake his unease. He started keeping records, documenting which of his patients had been cared for by Eleanor and what had happened to them. The pattern became clear. Patients under Eleanor's care died at significantly higher rates than patients cared for by other private nurses. The deaths were faster, less predictable, often occurring when family members were not present. Dr. Matthews brought his findings to the medical board and to local authorities. Even then, there was resistance to the idea that a beloved nurse might be a killer. Eleanor had an impeccable reputation. Family spoke highly of her. She had never given anyone reason to doubt her. But the evidence was compelling enough that an investigation was launched. Authorities began interviewing families of patients who had died under Eleanor's care. They exhumed several bodies and performed autopsies. They found traces of morphine in amounts far exceeding what had been prescribed. They found evidence of poisoning in other cases. And when they confronted Eleanor with this evidence, expecting denials and outrage, she surprised them by confessing. She didn't confess to everything immediately. At first, she admitted to a few cases, claiming they had been mercy killings, that she had been trying to end suffering. But as the investigation continued, as more evidence emerged, her story changed. She admitted to more killings. And then more. Eventually, she confessed to having killed more than 30 patients, though investigators suspected the actual number was higher. Some of the bodies had been cremated. Some of the records had been lost. There was no way to know for certain how many people Eleanor Bright had murdered during her 12-year career as a private nurse. The question that everyone wanted answered was why. Why had she done it? What had motivated her to kill so many people who had trusted her, who had been vulnerable and dependent on her care? Eleanor's answers were inconsistent. Sometimes she claimed it had been mercy, that she was ending suffering. Sometimes she suggested it had been about money, though she hadn't received any unusual payments or inheritances from her victims. Sometimes she simply said she didn't know why, that it had felt right at the time, that she had enjoyed the feeling of being present at the moment of death. Psychologists who evaluated her struggled to categorize her. She didn't fit neatly into the understanding of criminal psychology that existed at the time. She wasn't obviously insane in the legal sense. She understood that killing was wrong. She had taken steps to avoid detection. She had functioned successfully in society for years. But there was clearly something fundamentally broken in her psychology, some absence of normal human empathy and morality that had allowed her to kill repeatedly without apparent remorse. The trial was a sensation. Newspapers covered it extensively. Eleanor Bright became a figure of public fascination and horror. How could this smiling, gentle woman have killed so many people? How could families have invited her into their homes, trusted her with their most vulnerable loved ones, never suspecting what she was capable of? The trial forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about trust and vulnerability, about the fact that evil doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it arrives wearing a pleasant face and carrying professional credentials. Eleanor was found guilty on multiple counts of murder, but instead of being sentenced to death, she was declared criminally insane and committed to an institution for the criminally insane, where she would spend the rest of her life. The decision was controversial. Many people felt she should have been executed, but the medical testimony about her psychological state was compelling enough that the judge decided institutionalization was appropriate. Eleanor Bright lived in that institution for another 32 years. She never expressed genuine remorse for what she had done. She participated in interviews with psychologists and researchers who were trying to understand her, but her answers remained evasive and self-serving. She maintained that she had been trying to help people, that she had been misunderstood, that her actions had been motivated by compassion. No one who studied her case believed this. She had killed for pleasure, for power, for the satisfaction of controlling life and death. The mercy angle was a rationalization, a story she told herself to justify the unjustifiable. She died in 1943 at the age of 70, having outlived most of the people who had known her during her years as a nurse. Her death received minimal attention. By that point, she was a footnote, a historical curiosity, largely forgotten except by specialists in criminal psychology. But her case had lasting impact. It contributed to the development of better oversight in healthcare, to the creation of systems designed to track unusual patterns in patient deaths, to increase scrutiny of people in positions of medical authority. The lessons learned from Eleanor Bright's murders helped prevent similar cases in the future, though they couldn't undo the harm she had caused. The families of her victims received no real justice. Many of them never knew for certain whether their loved ones had been murdered or had died naturally. The exhumations and autopsies only covered a fraction of Eleanor's suspected victims. The rest remained buried with their secrets, their deaths forever ambiguous. For the families who did receive confirmation that their loved one had been murdered, the knowledge brought no comfort. They had trusted Eleanor Bright. They had paid her to care for someone they loved. and she had betrayed that trust in the most profound way possible. Now we've reached the end of these 5 cases. 5 different killers, 5 different sets of circumstances, 5 different time periods. But the common thread remains constant. Trust was given. Trust was betrayed. People died because someone they relied on chose violence over care, chose destruction over preservation, chose their own desires over the lives and well-being of others. Daniel Mercer murdered his 5 children because he couldn't accept losing control of his family. Victor Hale murdered the couple who tried to help him, possibly because freedom felt more threatening than prison, or because violence was the only response he understood when faced with stress. Marcus Bell was released after serving time for one murder and immediately began killing again, proving that some people never change, that rehabilitation is sometimes impossible. Caleb Rowe drifted through the world, leaving bodies behind him, constructing delusional justifications for violence that was simply the expression of a broken mind. Eleanor Bright killed for more than a decade, using her position as a nurse to murder vulnerable patients while hiding behind a mask of compassion and professionalism. These cases span more than a century, but the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. Predators exist. They have always existed. They will continue to exist. The question is not whether evil is real, because these cases prove that it is. The question is what we do about it. How do we protect vulnerable people? How do we identify warning signs? How do we create systems that don't fail the way they failed in these cases? Let's examine the systemic failures first, because they're the most preventable. In Daniel Mercer's case, a teacher reported concerns to social services. An investigation was conducted, but the investigator didn't see enough evidence to intervene, or perhaps wasn't trained to recognize more subtle forms of abuse and control. The children were afraid, but had been conditioned not to show that fear openly. Daniel was skilled at presenting a facade of normalcy. And so the case was closed, and months later those children were dead. Could better training for investigators have changed the outcome? Could a system that took multiple reports more seriously have saved those lives? Possibly. We'll never know for certain, but the possibility is haunting. In Victor Hale's case, the parole board released him after 18 years based on his compliance with prison programs and his clean disciplinary record. But compliance in a structured environment doesn't indicate readiness for freedom. Prison provides external control. Parole requires internal control, self-regulation, the ability to manage stress and impulses without constant supervision. Victor had never developed those capacities. He had learned how to follow rules when someone was watching, but he had no internal compass guiding him when he was alone. The parole board either didn't recognize this or didn't consider it disqualifying. And Marianne and Edwin Cole paid for that failure with their lives. Marcus Bell's case represents an even more egregious systemic failure. He strangled a woman and burned her body at age 19. That's not a crime of passion or opportunity. That's deliberate, sustained violence followed by calculated disposal. And yet he was released after 15 years, with minimal supervision, free to kill again. The parole board saw that he had completed programs, that he had behaved well in prison. But did anyone seriously evaluate whether he had changed fundamentally? Did anyone look at the nature of his original crime and consider what it revealed about his character? Or was he simply a case file, a box to be checked, another name to be moved through the system? Within months of release, he murdered Angela Martinez, then Jennifer Kim, then Sarah Louise Chun, then 15-year-old Amanda Torres. For more victims who would be alive if Marcus Bell had remained in prison. The counterargument, of course, is that we can't keep everyone in prison forever based on the possibility they might reoffend. Prison populations are already massive. Parole systems exist because life sentences for every crime would be economically and socially unsustainable. But there's a middle ground between releasing everyone and imprisoning everyone forever. That middle ground involves serious evaluation of risk, adequate supervision after release, and consequences when warning signs appear. Marcus Bell's parole officer visited once a month, asked basic questions, filed reports. But there was no real monitoring, no deep engagement with whether Marcus was actually functioning successfully in society. He was compliant, which is not the same as safe. And no one noticed until 4 women were dead. Caleb Rowe's case highlights a different kind of failure. His victims were people on the margins of society. Transient workers, undocumented immigrants, women in vulnerable situations. These are people whose disappearances are often not investigated seriously, whose missing persons reports get filed and forgotten. Caleb knew this. He selected victims specifically because they were less likely to be missed, less likely to have families or communities demanding answers. And he was right. Thomas and David disappeared, and no one reported them missing. Carlos saw evidence of murders happening in his own house, but was too afraid to report it because of his immigration status. These systemic vulnerabilities create opportunities for predators. There are people who would argue that we need harsher laws, longer sentences, more surveillance, more control. And maybe there's some truth to that for certain offenders. But harsh laws didn't stop these killings. Daniel Mercer knew killing his children would result in life in prison, and he did it anyway. Victor Hale had already served 18 years and feared returning to prison, yet he killed anyway. Marcus Bell had experienced prison and knew what awaited him if he was caught again, yet he killed 4 more women anyway. Caleb Rowe was actively trying to avoid capture, but continued killing even as the risk increased. Eleanor Bright operated in an era when murder could result in execution, yet she killed dozens of people. Harsh consequences don't deter people whose psychology is fundamentally broken. What might actually help is earlier intervention, better mental health resources, systems that take reports of domestic violence and child abuse seriously, that investigate thoroughly rather than superficially. Better training for professionals who interact with at-risk individuals, teaching them to recognize warning signs that aren't obvious. Daniel Mercer showed signs of obsessive anxiety and need for control years before he killed his children. If he had received effective mental health treatment, if the custody evaluation had been more thorough, if someone had taken the children's fear seriously, maybe those 5 kids would be alive today. Maybe is a painful word, but it's all we have in retrospect. The same applies to Victor Hale. He was released from prison with no real support system, no genuine preparation for re-entry into society. He was expected to simply figure out how to function after 18 years of institutionalization. When he struggled, when he started drinking, when the stress became overwhelming, there was no safety net, no intervention until it was too late. Marianne and Edwin were trying to provide that support, but they were civilians doing the work that should have been done by professional re-entry programs. And they paid for the state's failure with their lives. There's also the question of how we think about violence and the people who commit it. Our cultural narratives tend to present violent criminals as obviously different from normal people, as monsters we can easily identify and avoid. But the reality is more complicated and more disturbing. Daniel Mercer was anxious and controlling, but plenty of anxious and controlling people never hurt anyone. Victor Hale had committed armed robbery, but had never been violent toward people in prison. Marcus Bell seemed compliant and reformed. Caleb Rowe appeared to be just another drifter, unremarkable and forgettable. Eleanor Bright was beloved by the families she worked for. None of them fit the stereotype of a monster. They looked like regular people, which is precisely what made them so dangerous. Evil rarely announces itself with dramatic signs and ominous music. It doesn't arrive wearing a mask and carrying a weapon, making its intentions clear. More often, it arrives looking normal, sounding reasonable, asking for trust. It arrives as a stressed father who loves his children but is struggling with divorce. It arrives as a released prisoner who seems grateful for a second chance. It arrives as a reformed offender who has completed all the required programs. It arrives as a drifter looking for work and a place to sleep. It arrives as a smiling nurse who sits beside your hospital bed, holding your hand. The victims in these cases made reasonable decisions based on the information available to them. Lena Mercer had a court order mandating that her children visit their father. She couldn't have prevented those visits without violating the law. Marianne and Edwin Cole were trying to help someone reintegrate into society, a compassionate and socially valuable thing to do. The parole board released Marcus Bell based on his prison record and completion of programs. The women Marcus killed were simply living their lives, going to work, walking home, being in public spaces where they had every right to be. Caleb Rowe's victims were working, surviving, existing in the same marginal spaces that millions of people occupy every day. Eleanor Bright's victims were sick people who needed nursing care, who had no reason to suspect that the cheerful woman caring for them was also poisoning them. None of these victims did anything wrong. They trusted when trust seemed reasonable. They followed procedures. They made ordinary choices that, in a functional world, would have been safe. But the world isn't always functional. Systems fail. People lie. Evil exists, and sometimes it succeeds despite everyone doing what they're supposed to do. So what do we take from these stories? What's the lesson beyond the obvious observation that terrible things happen? The lesson is not to become paranoid or to stop trusting anyone. That's not a functional way to live. Human society requires trust. We have to trust that most people are decent, that most systems work most of the time, that the world is generally safe enough to navigate. Complete paranoia would be paralyzing. But we can be aware. We can pay attention to warning signs. We can take reports seriously when someone says they feel unsafe. We can create better systems for monitoring released offenders. We can provide actual support for people re-entering society after incarceration, rather than just releasing them and hoping for the best. We can investigate disappearances thoroughly, especially of vulnerable people whose cases might otherwise be ignored. We can create oversight in professions that provide access to vulnerable individuals. None of this will prevent every tragedy, but it might prevent some of them. And some is better than none. We can also remember the victims, not just as statistics or as names in a case file, but as people who had lives and futures that were stolen from them. Daniel Mercer's 5 children would be teenagers now. They would be learning to drive, going to school dances, thinking about college, experiencing first loves and heartbreaks, and all the complicated joy of growing up. But they'll never get that chance because their father decided his pain was more important than their lives. Marianne and Edwin Cole were good people doing good work. They believed in rehabilitation and second chances. They opened their home to someone who needed help. Their compassion wasn't naive or foolish. It was admirable. The failure wasn't theirs. The failure was systemic, and it cost them everything. Angela Martinez was 23. Jennifer Kim was 19. Sarah Louise Chun was 26. Amanda Torres was 15. Each of them had families who loved them, friends who missed them, futures they were building. Marcus Bell took all of that away because he enjoyed killing and because the system released him when it shouldn't have. Thomas, David, Carlos, and Lisa. For people whose names most people will never know, whose deaths barely registered in the public consciousness because they were transient, marginal, easy to overlook. But they mattered. They were human beings with their own stories, their own struggles, their own right to exist without being murdered by someone like Caleb Rowe. Their lives had value even if society didn't always treat them that way. And the 30-plus victims of Eleanor Bright, most of whose names we'll never know with certainty. Elderly people, sick people, people at the end of their lives who deserved comfort and care, not murder. People whose families trusted Eleanor to help them, who paid her to provide compassionate nursing, who never imagined she was systematically poisoning their loved ones. Those families lived with grief compounded by betrayal, knowing that the person they had welcomed into their homes, the person they had been grateful to, had been a killer all along. These victims deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for the fact that they lived. They had personalities and preferences. They had favorite foods and songs they loved. They had inside jokes with friends and memories of good times. They had flaws and strengths, fears and hopes. They were complete human beings whose stories were cut short by violence. If there's anything positive to take from these cases, it's that they've contributed to changes in how we handle similar situations now. Daniel Mercer's case led to reforms in how custody evaluations are conducted, how reports of child abuse are investigated, how courts balance parental rights against child safety. The failures in his case have been studied and used to train social workers and investigators, hopefully preventing similar tragedies. Victor Hale's case contributed to discussions about reentry programs for released prisoners, about the inadequacy of simply releasing people without support systems, about the need for better mental health resources and monitoring. Some jurisdictions have improved their programs as a result, though many others still release people with minimal support and then act surprised when things go wrong. Marcus Bell's case highlighted the dangers of releasing violent offenders based solely on prison behavior without adequate assessment of their actual risk to the community. It contributed to reforms in how parole boards evaluate candidates for release, how they consider the nature of the original crime, how they balance the possibility of rehabilitation against public safety. Not every jurisdiction has adopted these reforms, but some have, and that saved lives. Caleb Rowe's case brought attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women, to the way disappearances of marginalized people are often not investigated seriously, to the need for better coordination between jurisdictions when tracking potential serial offenders. Advocacy groups have used his case to push for reforms, for databases that track disappearances across state lines, for requirements that law enforcement take missing persons reports seriously regardless of the victim's social status. Eleanor Bright's case, despite happening more than a century ago, contributed to the development of modern healthcare oversight. The fact that she was able to kill so many patients over so many years without detection led to the creation of systems designed to track unusual patterns in patient deaths, to investigate when mortality rates seem abnormal, to provide oversight of healthcare workers who have unsupervised access to vulnerable patients. Modern hospital protocols and regulatory systems exist partly because of cases like hers. None of these reforms bring back the dead. None of them undo the suffering of the families left behind. But they might prevent future cases. They might save people who would otherwise become victims. And that matters. It doesn't balance the scales or provide justice in any meaningful sense, but it's something. It's the living learning from the dead, trying to build a world where similar tragedies are less likely to occur. There's also value in simply bearing witness to these stories, in acknowledging that they happened, in refusing to look away even when it's uncomfortable. These cases are difficult to hear about because they force us to confront truths we'd rather ignore. They force us to acknowledge that trust can be weaponized, that systems fail, that people we're supposed to rely on sometimes hurt us instead of helping us. They challenge our assumptions about safety and predictability. They remind us that we live in a world where terrible things can happen to anyone, where being good and following rules doesn't guarantee protection. But looking away doesn't make the reality disappear. Pretending these things don't happen doesn't prevent them from happening. The only way to address these problems is to acknowledge them, to study them, to understand how and why they occur, and to build better systems based on that understanding. That requires being willing to sit with discomfort, to listen to difficult stories, to think seriously about violence and victimization and systemic failure. It also requires remembering that the vast majority of people are not violent predators. Most parents don't harm their children. Most people released from prison don't kill again. Most drifters and transient workers are just trying to survive, not looking for victims. Most nurses provide genuine care rather than poisoning their patients. The cases we've discussed tonight are exceptional precisely because they're aberrations from normal human behavior. They stand out because they're unusual, but unusual doesn't mean rare enough to ignore. These things happen with sufficient frequency that we need to take them seriously, need to build systems that can identify and prevent them when possible. The balance is difficult. We need to be aware without being paranoid. We need to be cautious without being paralyzed by fear. We need to trust while also being willing to listen when something feels wrong. One of the most important lessons from these cases is the value of listening to people who express fear or concern. The oldest Mercer child told his mother he didn't want to go back to his father's house. That was a warning sign that should have been taken more seriously. Crystal Shaw's grandmother told her that Marcus Bell was trouble, that she should stay away from him. That warning came too late for Crystal, but it was accurate. Rebecca's sister knew that Caleb Rowe was dangerous, tried to warn her, but Rebecca disappeared anyway. These warnings came from people who were paying attention, who noticed things that others missed. We need to take such warnings seriously, need to investigate rather than dismiss, need to act even when it's inconvenient or difficult. We also need to be willing to report concerns even when we're not certain, even when it might be awkward or might damage relationships. The teacher who reported concerns about the Mercer children did the right thing, even though the investigation didn't lead to intervention. That teacher tried. That teacher paid attention. The fact that the system failed to act on that report doesn't mean the report shouldn't have been made. We need more people willing to speak up when they see warning signs, not fewer. And we need systems that take reports seriously, that investigate thoroughly, that don't close cases prematurely because initial observations seem fine. Daniel Mercer was good at presenting a normal facade during the social services visit. But one visit with a man who was prepared and performing doesn't capture the reality of daily life in that household. Better systems would involve longer observation periods, multiple visits, conversations with children in settings where they feel safe to speak honestly. Better systems cost more money and require more resources, which is why they often don't get implemented. But the cost of not implementing them is measured in lives. For individuals, the lesson is simpler but no less important. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong even if you can't articulate exactly why. If someone makes you uncomfortable, maintain distance even if you can't justify that discomfort logically. If someone's behavior seems inconsistent or their story doesn't add up, don't dismiss that observation. Our subconscious often picks up on warning signs before our conscious mind can process them. That feeling of unease serves a purpose. It's worth listening to. At the same time, we can't let fear dominate our lives. We can't stop helping people because sometimes help is met with violence. We can't stop trusting anyone because sometimes trust is betrayed. We can't stop letting our children see their other parent because one father killed his children. The answer isn't to retreat into isolation and suspicion. The answer is to be thoughtful, to pay attention, to take reasonable precautions while still living full lives. As we close this examination of 5 cases spanning more than a century, the final thought to leave you with is this: evil rarely arrives screaming. Sometimes, it arrives smiling and invited inside. It looks like a stressed father, a grateful ex-convict, a reformed offender, a transient worker, a dedicated nurse. It sounds reasonable. It acts normal. It's only in retrospect, after the damage is done, that the warning signs become obvious. But obvious in retrospect doesn't help the victims. What helps is attention in the moment. What helps is taking concerns seriously. What helps is building systems that don't fail vulnerable people. What helps is remembering that beneath every crime statistic is a human being whose life mattered, whose death diminished the world, whose story deserves to be told and remembered. Daniel Mercer's 5 children deserve to grow up. Marianne and Edwin Cole deserve to continue their work helping others. Angela Martinez, Jennifer Kim, Sarah Louise Chun, and Amanda Torres deserve to live their lives. Thomas, David, Carlos, and Lisa deserved safety and dignity. The 30-plus victims of Eleanor Bright deserve comfort in their final days, not murder. All of these people mattered. All of them are gone. And all of them should be remembered not just as victims, but as people who lived, who were loved, who had value that extended far beyond the terrible way their lives ended. If you've stayed with us through all of these stories, thank you. I know it hasn't been easy. These are heavy topics, difficult truths, painful realities. But they're important. They need to be discussed and understood. The victims deserve to be remembered. The failures need to be acknowledged so they can be addressed. And we all need to be reminded that vigilance matters, that attention matters, that speaking up when something seems wrong can save lives. Before you go, if you found value in this examination of these cases, if you think these stories need to be heard and remembered, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps ensure that more people hear these stories, that more people learn from these cases, that the victims are remembered by a wider audience. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. We'd love to know who's out there listening, who's taking the time to sit with these difficult stories and think about what they mean. These stories don't have happy endings. There's no redemption arc, no moment where everything makes sense, no satisfying conclusion that ties everything together. There's just loss and grief and the slow work of trying to build systems that might prevent similar losses in the future. That's not the kind of ending people usually want from their stories. But it's the truth, and truth matters more than comfort. Remember the victims. Learn from the failures. Pay attention to warning signs. Trust your instincts. Speak up when something seems wrong. Take concerns seriously. Build better systems. Support vulnerable people. And never forget that behind every crime statistic is a human being whose life had value, whose death matters, whose story deserves to be told. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough to hear these difficult stories. Thank you for remembering the victims. And thank you for being the kind of person who's willing to confront uncomfortable truths rather than looking away. The world needs more people like that. Stay safe. Take care of each other. And remember that while evil exists, so does goodness. So does compassion. So does the human capacity to learn from tragedy and build something better from the wreckage. Good night. And may you find peace despite the darkness we've explored together.